Let me introduce you to one of the great tricks of the 20th century, a racket so audacious, so typical American in its ambition, that one almost has to admire the sheer nerve of this thing before one recoils from its consequences. Lafayette Ronald Hubbard was born on the 13th of March 1911 in Tilden, Nebraska, a fact worth stating plainly at the outset, because almost nothing else that Mr. Hubbard ever said about himself survives contact with documentary record. He claimed to be a nuclear physicist. Actually, he flunked the one course in molecular physics he ever took and left George Washington University without a degree. He claimed to be a war hero, wounded and blinded in combat. The United States Navy's own files show a mediocre officer relieved of command after conducting a lengthy depth charge attack on what was almost certainly a magnetic deposit on the ocean floor, and then shelling Mexican territory by mistake. He claimed to have healed himself of his war wounds by the power of his own mind. The Veterans Administration, as we shall see, had rather a different file on him. What Hubbard actually was, and this is not nothing, was a fantastically prolific hack. Through the 1930s and 1940s, he churned out pulp fiction at a penny a word, westerns, adventure yarns, and above all science fiction for magazines like Astounding Science Fiction under his own name, and a rummage sale of pseudonyms: Winchester Remington Colt, Kurt von Rachen, René Lafayette. He could produce 70,000 words a month. The typewriter, it was said, ran hot. And it is here, in the smoky company of the science fiction fraternity of the late 1940s, that the crucial remark was made. Multiple witnesses, among them the science fiction editor Sam Moskowitz, recalling a 1948 meeting of the Eastern Science Fiction Association in Newark, New Jersey, and separately the writers Lloyd Eschbach and Theodore Sturgeon, attested that Hubbard said words to this effect: "Writing for a penny a word is ridiculous. If a man really wanted to make millions of dollars, the best way would be to start his own religion. The Church of Scientology has spent decades denying that its founder ever said any such thing. I invite you to consider the evidence of what he then proceeded, with remarkable efficiency, to do." In May of 1950, Hubbard published Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, trailed the same month by an article in Astounding Science Fiction, which tells you a good deal about the peer review process involved. Dianetics proposed that the human mind was encrusted with engrams, recordings of the past trauma, which could be erased through a talking procedure called auditing, whereupon one would become clear, free of illness, irrationality, even the common cold. The book was a sensation. It sold in hundreds of thousands. It was also, from the standpoint of anything resembled science, garbage. And the scientists said so. In September 1950s, the American Psychological Association passed a resolution cautioning its members that Hubbard's claims were not supported by empirical evidence. The medical and psychiatric establishment dismissed Dianetics as quackery, and Hubbard as a man constitutionally incapable of absorbing criticism, never forgot it and never forgave it. Hold that thought. It is the seed of everything that follows. The Dianetics fad burned out. The Hubbard Dianetic Research Foundation collapsed into bankruptcy by 1952, and here Hubbard executed the pivot of a genius. Therapy is taxable and regulable. Religion is neither. In December 1953, in Camden, New Jersey, he incorporated the Church of Scientology. The first church opened in Los Angeles in February 1954. In a 1953 letter to his associate, Helen O'Brien, Hubbard mused, with a candor his followers are not encouraged to study, about the religion angle. And what a religion! Hubbard structured it, and one must concede the craftsmanship, precisely like the serialized pulp fiction he had spent 20 years writing. You do not get the whole story at once. You ascend the bridge to total freedom, level by level, auditing session by auditing session, each one paid for, each one dangling the next revelation just out of reach, a cliffhanger with an invoice attached. Past the stage clear lie the stage operating Titan, levels OT1 through OT8, at a cumulative cost that former members reliably placed in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. It is the miniseries as Salvation. Tune in next week and bring your checkbook. And what does the faithful pilgrim discover at OT3? The Wall of Fire, a document Hubbard composed in 1967 and which members may read only after years of preparation and vast expense, because they are warned premature exposure to it can kill. They discovered this. 70 million years ago, a galactic overlord named Xenu, ruler of 76-planet Galactic Confederacy, solved an overpopulation problem by rounding up billions of his citizens with the help, please note, of psychiatrists who lured them in for income tax inspections and paralyzed them with injections, flying them to Earth, then called TGAC, in a spacecraft that Hubbard describes as resembling DC-8 airliners, stacking them around volcanoes and detonating hydrogen bombs on top of them. The disembodied souls of these victims, body titans, now cling to each of us in clusters and are the true cause of our miseries. Advanced Scientology consists of paying to have them audited off one by one. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the load-bearing wall. Not a metaphor, not a parable. It is presented as engineering fact, as history. It is a science fiction story written by a science fiction writer, sold as science fiction prices, multiplied by several orders of magnitude. When the documents surfaced in the court proceedings and later on the internet, the church did not laugh it off as allegory. It sued frantically on grounds of copyright, thereby confirming authorship of the very cosmology it publicly declines to discuss. There is something almost perfect in a church asserting intellectual property rights over its own creation myth. Hubbard understood something profound about his adopted home in Southern California, that in America celebrity is the established church, and he proposed to franchise it. As early as 1955, he launched Project Celebrity, circulating a written list of quarry, his word, to be hunted and recruited. Orson Welles, Walt Disney, Ernest Hemingway, Greta Garbo, Marlene Dietrich, Bob Hope, Howard Hughes. That generation, to its credit, declined the honor. The next did not. In 1969, the church opened its first celebrity center in Hollywood and a dedicated facility for the care, feeding, and flattering of the famous. John Travolta was recruited in 1975. Kirstie Alley credited Scientology with her salvation. Priscilla Presley, and for a time Lisa Marie Presley, the jazz pianist Chick Corea, Isaac Hayes, Juliette Lewis, Elizabeth Moss. The roll call is long, and towering above them all, Tom Cruise, brought in around 1986 and elevated by church leader David Miscavige into something between a co-regent and a holy relic. The man who, we are told, was at one point considered by insiders to be among the most important beings on the planet. Keep Mr. Cruise in mind. He has a speaking part in the war we are about to examine, for that is the theme to which all of this has been prologue. The strangest, longest, most vindictive grudge in the history of American religion, Scientology's total war against psychiatry. Why psychiatry? Why would a church whose competitors might more logically be other churches devote itself instead to the destruction of a branch of medicine? Begin with the biographical wound. In October 1947, before Dianetics, before the church, a struggling and evidently desperate L. Ron Hubbard wrote to the Veterans Administration requesting psychiatric help. In that letter, he described periods of moroseness and suicidal inclinations, and stated frankly that his mind has been affected and that he could not access treatment privately for lack of funds. Read it again. The man who would later teach millions that psychiatry is a cosmic criminal conspiracy had personally, in writing, begged for its help, and apparently never received it. Around the same period, he composed the private documents known as the Affirmations, self-hypnotic commands he wrote himself, later surfacing in litigation, in which he instructs his own mind that his lies would be believed, that he was not guilty, that all men are his slaves. It is a pitiable portrait of a disordered psyche as one could ask for. Written in the first person by the subject himself, Hubbard never sought treatment again, never acknowledged any affliction, and instead did what grandiosity always does. He declared himself the physician and the entire profession the disease. Then, at the professional wound of 1950, the psychologists and psychiatrists' public dismissal of Dianetics as unscientific. Hubbard had offered himself as the greatest discovery in the history of the mind, a milestone for men comparable to the discovery of fire, he modestly wrote, and the men with the actual credentials had called him what it was. From that moment, psychiatry became in Hubbard's expanding mythology not merely wrong, but evil. Evil on the time scale of trillions of years. Psychiatrists, psychs, in the church's internal argot, appear in the scripture as an ancient galactic criminal class. They are there, as we have seen, assisting Xenu at the genocide of 75 million years ago. He blamed them in various pronouncements for crimes, for war, for the decline of civilization, and with a special obscenity for the Holocaust itself, a libel his church's front groups repeat to this day. And, permit me one final biographical detail, because history does occasionally furnish an irony too exquisite to invent. When Hubbard died in seclusion on the 24th of January 1986 on a ranch near Creston, California, having spent his last years hiding from process servers, the San Luis Obispo County coroner found in his blood the drug hydroxyzine, marketed as Vistaril, a psychiatric medication used, among others, for anxiety. The prophet of the anti-psychiatry crusade went to his reward with a psych drug in his veins. Doctrine, however deranged, might be harmless if it stayed on the page. It did not. In 1969, the Church co-founded the Citizens Commission on Human Rights, the CCHR, and listed as figurehead the psychiatrist Thomas Szasz, who had his own libertarian critique of his profession and later insisted he never shared the Church's theology. The CCHR presents itself as a human rights watchdog. It is a siege engine. It lobbies legislatures against psychiatric medication, pickets psychiatric conventions, and in December 2005 opened on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood a permanent museum with the subtle title Psychiatry, an Industry of Death, in which visitors are informed that psychiatry masterminded the Holocaust and the September 11th attacks' ideological roots, an exhibit that manages to slander both medicine and history in a single admission-free visit. In the early 1990s, the Church mounted a coordinated campaign against Eli Lilly antidepressant Prozac, flooding media and the FDA with claims that the drug drove users to murder and suicide. The FDA's advisory committee examined the claims in 1991 and found them unsupported. The Church has campaigned for decades against Ritalin and the treatment of children with ADHD, against electroconvulsive therapy, against the very existence of psychiatric diagnosis. And then there is a case that should never be forgotten because a woman is dead. Lisa McPherson, a Scientologist of 18 years standing, was involved in a minor car accident in Clearwater, Florida on the 18th of November 1995. She removed her clothes in the street and told paramedics she needed help. She was taken to a hospital where church members intervened to remove her from psychiatric observation because psychiatry is the enemy, and checked her instead into a church's Fort Harrison hotel for the Hubbard prescribed introspection rundown. 17 days later, on the 5th of December 1995, she was dead, emaciated, dehydrated, her body marked by what the original medical examiner attributed to insect bites. The state of Florida indicted the church in 1998 on charges including abuse of disabled adult. After the medical examiner controversially revised the cause of death, the charges were dropped in 2000 and the family's civil suit was settled confidentially in 2004. No doctrine that ends with Lisa McPherson dying in a cot, denied medical care because of a dead science fiction writer's grudge, deserves the polite word religion without heavy qualifications. For public flavor, one need only to recall the 24th of June 2005, when Tom Cruise, the faith's most luminous asset, lectured the Today Show's Matt Lauer that psychiatry is a pseudoscience, that there is no such a thing as chemical imbalance, and that he, Mr. Cruise, knew the history of psychiatry, this shortly after publicly rebuking the actress Brooke Shields for treating her postpartum depression with medication. It was the whole doctrine in miniature, the invincible confidence, the borrowed jargon, the cruelty to the suffering delivered in a morning chat show. Now to the church's own great instrument, which is the law, used not as a shield but as a bludgeon. Hubbard wrote the mission statement himself in 1955, and it deserves quotation because churches do not usually put such things in writing. The purpose of a lawsuit, he instructed, is to harass and discourage rather than to win. The law, he added, can be used very easily to harass, and enough harassment on somebody simply on the thin edge will generally be sufficient to cause his professional decease. In 1967, he codified the fair game doctrine, declaring that a suppressive person, anyone the church deems an enemy, may be deprived of property or injured by any means, may be tricked, sued, or lied to or destroyed. The church later announced it had cancelled the label. The practice, former executives testify, merely dropped the letterhead. Consider the journalist Paulette Cooper, who in 1971 published A Scandal of Scientology. The church's response, in a documented operation actually named Operation Freakout, was to attempt to have her imprisoned or committed to a mental institution, their words, in their own files, by, among other things, forging bomb threats in her name using stationery bearing her fingerprints. She was indicted by a federal grand jury in 1973 for crimes she did not commit, and was exonerated only after the FBI, raiding church offices on the 8th of July 1977, found the plot described in Scientology's own documents. That raid, incidentally, was occasioned by Operation Snow White, the largest infiltration of the United States government in its history, in which as many as 5,000 church operatives penetrated some 136 agencies, including the IRS and the Department of Justice, to steal and purge files unflattering to Hubbard. 11 senior Scientologists went to prison for it, including Mary Sue Hubbard, the founder's own wife, convicted in 1979, while the great man who had directed the program's antecedents remained an unindicted co-conspirator and stayed conveniently over the horizon. The pattern is constant. When Time magazine published Richard Behar's investigation, The Thriving Cult of Greed and Power, in May 1991, the church answered with a $416 million libel suit that consumed a decade before its final dismissal. When the Cult Awareness Network kept referring worried families to critics, the church buried it under dozens of lawsuits until it collapsed into bankruptcy in 1996, whereupon, in a twist worthy of a pulp novelist, Scientologist purchased its name and phone number so that desperate parents calling the anti-cult hotline reached the cult. And the masterstroke, after a quarter-of-a-century war against the Internal Revenue Service, prosecuted through roughly 2,400 lawsuits by the church and its members against the agency and its individual officers, the IRS in October 1993 granted the church full tax exemption. The United States government, in effect, sued for peace. Former members who speak out, Jerry Armstrong, Debbie Cook, Leah Remini, Mike Rinder, face litigation, surveillance, and campaigns of defamation the church itself terms dead agenting. I know of no other religious body on earth of which one may say its most consistent sacrament is the deposition. How large is this colossus? The church claims 11,000 churches, missions and groups in 167 countries, and millions of members at various times, 10 million or 8 or simply many. Here the numbers performed their quiet comedy. Where actual censuses ask actual citizens, we find England and Wales, 2021, there were 1,854 Scientologists. Canada, 2021, there were 1,380. Australia, 2021, 1,655 and falling. In New Zealand, in 2018, there were 321. Ireland, in 2016, there were 87 so-called members. 87. The American Religious Identification Survey found roughly 25,000 self-described Scientologists in the United States in 2008, down by more than half from 2001. Independent researchers and senior defectors now put worldwide active membership and perhaps 20 to 40,000, that is roughly the crowd of a mid-table football fixture claiming the population of a continent. The church is shrinking nearly everywhere it can be measured. Convicted of organized fraud in France in 2009, the verdict upheld in 2013, kept under surveillance by Germany's domestic intelligence service as a threat to democratic order, liquidated by court order in Russia. Yet it grows richer as it grows smaller. And here is the trick worth understanding. Its income flows from fixed-price salvation, auditing, sold in blocks at rates that have run to hundreds of dollars an hour. A full journey up the bridge costing a small fortune. From relentless donation drives run by International Association of Scientologists and from a real estate empire, the gleaming, largely empty ideal orgs, plausibly worth well over $1 billion, all of it tax-free since 1993. All of it maintained by the C organization. Members signed, and I'm not making this up, 2 billion-year contracts, working for a pittance a week. It is not a growing faith. It is a shrinking congregation attached to an expanding property portfolio. And now observe the final asymmetry, which tells you everything about which party to this war deserves the name of a rational enterprise. Psychiatry does not fight back. In 75 years, you will search in vain for the American Psychiatric Association's counter-museum, its lawsuits against the church, its pickets outside Celebrity Center. There is no Scientology, an industry of death exhibit on Sunset Boulevard, though the materials for one are abundant. Psychiatry, whatever its genuine historical sins and its real scientific controversies, and it has both, and debates them in its own journals with a candor Scientology has never once permitted itself, is occupied with something else. It is occupied with the slow, unglamorous, self-correcting business of actually inquiry, the epidemiology of depression, the genetics of schizophrenia, the clinical trial, the revised diagnosis, the patient in the room. Science does not answer its hecklers because science and heckling are not conducted in the same language. A discipline that tests its claims has nothing to say to an organization whose central claim, the galactic tyrant, the volcanoes, the clinging souls of the murdered, is protected from testing by copyright law and cash. L. Ron Hubbard set out to prove that starting a religion was more profitable than writing science fiction. On the evidence, he was right about the money, but the fiction in the end stayed fiction, and the profession he hated buried him, went back to work, and never once looked back. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the difference between a science and a grudge.